The winter of 1814 didn't care about titles. It froze the blood of dukes and beggars alike. Charles Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, rode hard through the blinding white, desperate for the warmth of his estate. He barely glanced at the woman huddled in the snowbank, just another casualty of the frost. But as his horse plowed past, a flash of heavy navy wool caught his eye. The tarnished silver buttons, the familiar, unmistakable cut. It was his coat. Charles hated the snow. Poets wrote of its purity. Society ladies clapped their hands at the sight of it through double-glazed windows. Charles knew it for what it was, an executioner. It was 20 degrees below freezing. The wind howled off the moors, carrying sheets of ice that felt like crushed glass against the skin. Charles kept his head ducked low behind the collar of his greatcoat, trusting his stallion, Brutus, to find the road. London was 2 days behind him. Westford Manor was less than 5 miles ahead. He just had to survive the hour. The countryside was a white void. Hedges were buried. Trees were skeletal fingers grasping at a gray sky. Then Brutus shied. Charles grunted, tightening his grip on the reins. Easy. The horse sidestepped, his massive hooves breaking through the crust of the snow. Charles looked down. Beside the frozen ditch, half buried in a drift, was a dark shape, a body. Charles's jaw tightened. He did not stop. He was a duke, but he was not a savior. The parish workhouses were full of people who had given up against the winter. If he stopped for every frozen corpse in England, he would never reach home. He nudged Brutus forward. The horse took 1 step, 2. The wind shifted, violently tearing the top layer of snow off the huddled mass. Charles stopped. He didn't mean to. His hands simply pulled back on the leather. A corner of fabric had blown loose from the snowbank. It was navy blue, deep, dark military-grade wool, heavy and expensive. As Charles stared, a single silver button caught the dull gray light. It was stamped with a snarling hound. The Westford crest. Charles's breath hitched. A phantom pain, sharp and sudden, bloomed in his chest. It was a coat he hadn't seen in 14 months, a coat he had draped over the shivering shoulders of a woman on the terrace of a Mayfair ballroom, right before she vanished from his life forever. He didn't think. He vaulted off the horse. The snow swallowed his boots up to the knees. He waded through the drift, his breath pluming in violent white clouds. "Hey," he rasped, his voice swallowed by the wind. He reached the shape. It was a woman, curled into a tight, impossible ball. Frost clung to her eyelashes and the frayed edge of her hood. He grabbed the shoulder of the heavy navy coat and pulled. She was stiff, too light, the terrifying rigidity of freezing flesh. Charles cursed, a raw, ugly sound. He dropped to his knees in the snow, heedless of the wet seeping into his breeches. He grabbed her shoulders, hauling her out of the drift. "Wake up! Damn you! Open your eyes!" Her head lolled back. The hood fell away. Charles froze. The wind stopped howling. The cold vanished, replaced by a sudden sickening heat that rushed up the back of his neck. Harley. Her cheeks were hollowed out, her skin the color of skimmed milk. Her lips were cracked and tinged with a horrifying pale blue. This was not the radiant, sharp-tongued girl who had matched his wits in drawing rooms. This was a ghost, a starved, broken ghost. "Harley," he whispered. The anger he had harbored for over a year, the bitter gnawing fury of being left at the altar, evaporated. Panic took its place. He pulled a glove off with his teeth and pressed his bare fingers to her throat. Cold. So cold. But there, a pulse, faint, fluttering like a dying bird. He gathered her against his chest, preparing to carry her to the horse. As he shifted her weight, the heavy navy coat slipped open. A sound cut through the wind. A weak, mewling cry. Charles stopped breathing. He looked down. Tucked entirely inside the oversized coat, pressed flush against Harley's chest to steal whatever meager body heat she had left, was a bundle of rags. The bundle shifted. A tiny, red, furious face appeared from the folds. A baby. Charles stared at the child. Then he stared at the woman who had shattered his life. She had wrapped the baby in his coat. his protection, even in his absence. God above, Charles breathed. He didn't have time for the math. He didn't have time for the betrayal. He shoved the coat tightly closed around the infant, hoisted Harley over his shoulder like a sack of grain, and turned back to his horse. There was an old gamekeeper's cabin a mile off the main road. Charles knew it because he had spent his youth hiding in it. Now it was their only chance. Westford Manor was too far. She would be dead before they cleared the gates. He kicked the heavy oak door open. It slammed against the interior wall with a crack that sent a cloud of dust raining from the rafters. The inside was dark, smelling of stale earth, mice, and dry rot, but it was out of the wind. Charles laid Harley on the dusty cot in the corner. He moved with a violent, terrifying efficiency. He didn't look at her face. If he looked at her face, he would remember. If he remembered, he would hesitate. He found a stack of dry wood by the hearth. He piled it haphazardly, grabbed a handful of old straw, and struck his flint. Once, twice. On the third strike, a spark caught. He blew on it until the flame licked at the wood. Smoke billowed, stinging his eyes. "Come on," he muttered, feeding the fire until it roared. Only then did he turn back to the bed. Harley hadn't moved. The baby was crying louder now, a thin, reedy sound of absolute distress. Charles knelt by the cot. His hands were shaking. He, the Duke of Westford, who had coldly negotiated land treaties and stared down pistols at dawn, was trembling. He reached for the baby. He had to pry Harley's arms apart, even unconscious, even dying. Her muscles were locked in a death grip around the child. "Let go, B," he murmured, the old nickname slipping out like blood from a fresh cut. "I have him." Her arms finally gave way. Charles lifted the child. It was a boy. Small. Too small. Maybe 4 months old. The boy was shivering violently, his little fists clenched tight. Charles stripped off his own greatcoat, laid it by the hearth, and set the baby down on it, wrapping the thick wool around the tiny body. The warmth of the fire immediately hit the child, and the crying slowly settled into exhausted hiccups. Charles turned his attention to Harley. She was dying. He knew what freezing did to a body. The blood retreated to the core. The limbs died first. He pulled the navy coat off her. His coat. Underneath, her dress was a mockery of fabric, thin, patched cotton that belonged on a scullery maid, not the daughter of an earl. It was soaked through at the hem. He had to get it off her. Charles swallowed hard. He unbuttoned the ruined dress, his knuckles brushing against her icy skin. He stripped her down to her chemise, ignoring the sharp jut of her collarbones and the hollow of her ribs. He dragged a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket from an old chest in the corner and wrapped her tightly in it. He dragged the cot closer to the fire, close enough to feel the heat singe his own skin. Then he waited. The silence of the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the soft, shallow breaths of the woman and the child. Charles sat on a 3-legged stool, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at her. 14 months. 14 months ago, the invitations were sent. The flowers were ordered. He had bought her a ring with a diamond the size of an acorn. And then, 3 days before the wedding, he had gone to her townhouse. Empty. No note, no explanation. Just an empty house and a whisper in society that Harley Linfield had eloped with a nameless debtor to escape her father's ruin. Charles had torn London apart. Then he had stopped looking. He had rebuilt the walls around his heart with mortar made of pride and spite. And now, here she was, dropped at his feet by a winter storm. Harley stirred. Charles went entirely still. Her brow furrowed. A low moan escaped her cracked lips. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting the heavy weight of exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. They were hazel. Charles remembered that. They looked like crushed autumn leaves. Right now they were glassy and vacant. She stared at the ceiling, then at the fire. Then she gasped. It was a horrible, ragged sound. Her hands flew to her chest, grabbing at the blanket. My baby. Her voice was broken glass. She tried to sit up, but her muscles failed her. She collapsed back against the cot, panic rising in her chest. "Philip, where?" "He's here." The voice came from the shadows. Harley froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Charles sat in the dim light, the flames casting long, harsh shadows across his sharp jaw and dark, unreadable eyes. He wasn't moving. He looked like a carving of a vengeful god. Harley stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut, her head falling back against the mattress. "I'm dead," she whispered. "The cold took me. This is hell." "Not hell, Harley," Charles said quietly. He stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing. He walked over to the fire and scooped up the bundle of wool. He walked back to the cot and held the baby out to her. "Just Yorkshire." Harley didn't look at him. She snatched the baby from his hands with a ferocity that startled him. She buried her face in the infant's sparse hair, her shoulders shaking with dry, tearing sobs. She checked his fingers, his toes, his face, convincing herself he was alive. Charles watched her. He felt a sickening twist of jealousy, not of the child, but of the fierce, absolute love she was pouring into him, a love she had once promised to Charles. "You look terrible," he said. The words were cruel, meant to establish distance, to protect himself. Harley finally looked up at him. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep defensive exhaustion. "You were always a flatterer, Your Grace." Charles flinched. Your Grace, not Charles. "Whose is it?" he asked. The question tore out of him before he could stop it, raw, bleeding. Harley tightened her grip on the child. She looked away, staring into the flames. "Mine. I can see that. Who is the father?" "It doesn't matter." Charles took a step forward, his temper flaring. The cynical armor he wore so well cracked down the middle. "It doesn't matter? You vanished 3 days before our wedding. You subject me to the pity of the entire peerage. You ruin your own name. And 14 months later, I pull you out of a snowbank with a bastard child wrapped in my coat. I think it matters, Harley." She looked back at him. Her eyes were hollow, but there was a spark of the old, defiant fire in them. "You think you are the victim here, Charles? You think my leaving was about you? Wasn't it?" "I left to survive," she shouted, the effort causing a violent fit of coughing. She doubled over, clutching the baby to her chest. Charles instantly stepped forward, instinctively reaching for her. Don't touch me," she wheezed, pulling back against the wall of the cabin. "Don't." Charles dropped his hand. He stepped back. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. The heat in the small cabin had finally penetrated the damp cold, turning the air thick and stifling. Harley had stopped shivering. The baby, Philip, was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Harley sat propped against the rough log wall, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She watched Charles. He had taken off his waistcoat and rolled up his sleeves. He was feeding the fire with mechanical precision. He looked older, harder. The laugh lines she used to trace with her fingertips were gone, replaced by deep, bitter grooves around his mouth. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said quietly. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a vast, empty fatigue. Charles didn't turn around. He tossed a piece of pine into the flames. "I made sure of it. I gave orders to my solicitors to burn any letters from you." Harley let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I didn't write any." That made him look at her. His eyes were dark, capturing the firelight. "Why?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me." Charles stood up. He walked over to the single dusty window and looked out into the howling white. "Try me." Harley looked down at her hands. They were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding, hands that used to play the pianoforte at Almack's. "My father," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't just lose our money at the tables, Charles. He lost money that didn't belong to him, money that belonged to Lord Harrington." Charles turned. Harrington. The man was a vice lord. He dealt in illicit shipping, gambling dens, and worse. He was a monster wearing a velvet coat. "Harrington? Why the hell was your father dealing with him?" "Because Harrington promised to double his investment. Instead, he took everything. And then he demanded payment for the debt." Harley swallowed hard. £30,000. Charles's face went pale. 30,000. My father couldn't pay it, so Harrington offered a trade. She looked up, meeting Charles's gaze directly. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Me. Charles stopped breathing. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt. No. Yes. Harrington wanted a young, pretty wife with a title to legitimize him in society. He told my father that if I didn't marry him, he would have my father sent to Fleet Prison, and then he would ruin my sisters. He promised to drag my family through the mud until we starved. You were going to marry me, Charles said, his voice dangerously low. I could have paid the debt. I could have crushed Harrington. You don't understand, Harley pleaded, clutching the blanket. Harrington knew that. He came to me the night of the ball. The night you gave me that coat. He cornered me in the gardens. He told me that if I went to you, if I let you pay the debt, he would kill you. Charles stared at her. You think I'm afraid of Harrington? No, I know you aren't. I know you would have challenged him. You would have fought him. A tear finally spilled over, tracking a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. But he didn't fight fair, Charles. He told me he would put a bullet in your back in a dark alley. He said he would poison your hounds and burn Westford Manor to the ground with you inside it. I looked into his eyes, Charles, and I knew he wasn't lying. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Charles felt like he had been kicked in the chest by his horse. So you left, Charles rasped. I left. I met Harrington's men that night. I surrendered myself to him to clear the debt. Charles looked at the baby, the sleeping, innocent face. The math he had refused to do earlier suddenly hit him with brutal clarity. 14 months. The child was 4 months old. The boy, Charles said, his voice breaking. He's Harrington's. Harley closed her eyes. Yes. Charles turned away. He gripped the edge of the stone mantelpiece, his knuckles turning white. He felt physically sick. The woman he loved, the only woman he had ever loved, had sold herself to a monster to save his life, and the proof of her torment was sleeping softly on the cot. Where is he? Charles asked. The question was soft, but it carried a lethal, terrifying weight. Where's Harrington? Dead, Harley said flatly. Charles looked over his shoulder. He was thrown from his carriage 6 months ago, broke his neck. There was no grief in her voice, only a cold, hard fact. His creditors immediately descended. They took everything, the house, the clothes, the furniture. They threw me out on the street. I had nothing but Philip. And your coat. Why didn't you come to me then? Charles demanded, turning fully to face her. Why did you choose to starve in the snow rather than knock on my door? Harley looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the wealth, the power, the unbroken pride. Because I am ruined, Charles. I am the penniless widow of a criminal, holding a bastard child that bears his blood. And you are the Duke of Westford. You loved a girl who smelled of lavender and laughed at your jokes. That girl died 14 months ago. She pulled the baby closer. I didn't want you to look at me the way you are looking at me right now. Charles stood frozen. He realized what his face must be showing: horror, pity, rage. He looked at the coat resting on the floor, the heavy navy wool. He walked over and picked it up. He brushed the dust off the lapels. I gave you this coat, Charles said quietly, because you were shivering. I told you it would keep you safe until I could get you inside. Harley looked away. It kept us alive. It's the only reason Philip didn't freeze. Charles stepped toward the bed. He didn't stop until his knees bumped against the mattress. He reached out. Harley flinched, but Charles didn't touch her. He gently pulled the blanket up higher around her shoulders. Then he sat down on the edge of the cot. You're wrong, Charles said. His voice was no longer hard. It was exhausted, stripped of all pretense and pride. I don't care about the girl who smelled of lavender. I care about the woman who was brave enough to walk into hell to save my life. Harley let out a shattered breath, her chest heaving. Charles. He reached out, slowly, carefully, and rested his large, warm hand on the side of the baby's head. The child was warm, safe. He is not Harrington's, Charles said, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, terrifying intensity. Harrington is dead. He has no claim on the living. This boy is yours. Charles's thumb gently stroked the baby's cheek. And you are mine, if you will still have me. Harley stared at him. The walls she had built to survive the slums, the starvation, the endless cold cracked wide open. She leaned forward, burying her face against Charles's chest, right over his heart, and finally, truly, wept. Charles wrapped his arms around her and the child, burying his face in her tangled, soot-stained hair. The winter storm raged outside, burying the world in ice. But inside the cabin, the frost finally broke. The wind finally broke just before dawn. It didn't warm the earth, but the lethal howling gales subsided into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Charles did not wait for the sun. He wrapped Harley in every blanket the cabin held, swaddled Philip against his own chest beneath his dry waistcoat and overcoat, and carried Harley out to the horse. Brutus was restless, stamping his hooves in the deep drifts. Charles lifted her into the saddle, mounting behind her, pulling her back flush against his chest to share his body heat. The ride to Westford Manor took an hour. It felt like a lifetime. Harley drifted in and out of consciousness. Her head rested against his collarbone, her breathing alarmingly shallow. Every time she went still for too long, Charles would shake her shoulder. "Stay awake. Damn it, Bee. Stay with me." She would murmur something incoherent, and the terrifying cycle would begin again. When the wrought iron gates of Westford Manor finally materialized through the morning fog, Charles felt a physical snap in his chest, the tension giving way. He didn't bother guiding Brutus to the stables. He rode straight up the manicured, snow-choked gravel drive and halted at the massive oak front doors. "Finch!" Charles roared, his voice cracking the icy silence of the estate. It took less than 30 seconds. The heavy doors swung inward, spilling golden candlelight onto the snow. Mr. Finch, the head butler, stood in the threshold. His impeccable composure faltered for a fraction of a second at the sight of his master, half frozen and shouting from horseback. "Your Grace," Finch said, already stepping out into the biting cold, 2 footmen materializing behind him. "Get Mrs. Croft. Tell her to warm the master suite, boiling water, bricks for the bed, and send a rider for Dr. Lewis immediately," Charles commanded. He slid off Brutus, his legs screaming in protest after hours of frozen stillness. He reached up and carefully pulled Harley down into his arms. Finch stared at the bundle of rags and the hollow-cheeked woman emerging from them. He did not ask questions. A good butler never did. "At once, Your Grace." Charles carried her over the threshold. The contrast was physically jarring. Outside was death. Inside was a furnace of wealth. The manor smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and hothouse oranges. The grand foyer, with its sweeping mahogany staircase and marble floors, seemed to mock the dirty, soaked woman in his arms. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, was already hurrying down the stairs, tying a crisp white apron over her dark morning dress. She took one look at Charles, then at Harley, and the color drained from her face. She had been at Westford for 20 years. She knew exactly who Charles was holding. "Mother of God," Mrs. Croft whispered. "She is starved and half frozen," Charles said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic drawl. "And there is a child." He unbuttoned his overcoat, revealing the small blue wool bundle strapped to his chest. Philip was awake, staring at the grand chandelier above with wide, silent eyes. Mrs. Croft's maternal instincts overrode her shock. "Give the boy to me, Your Grace. I'll have the kitchen prepare warm milk and water. We have a maid, Sarah, who just weaned her own. She can nurse him if need be." Charles nodded, carefully transferring the infant. His hands lingered for a second on the wool. "Do not let him out of your sight, Mrs. Croft. If anything happens to him, I will burn this house to the ground." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, terrifying statement of fact. Mrs. Croft swallowed hard and nodded. Charles took the stairs 2 at a time. He bypassed the guest wings entirely and kicked open the door to his own chambers. A fire was already roaring in the hearth. 2 maids were frantically slipping brass bed warmers between the heavy silk sheets of the 4-poster bed. "Out!" Charles barked. The maids dropped their tools and scattered. Charles laid Harley gently on the bed, unconcerned as mud and snow stained the white coverlet. He removed her soaked boots and wrapped her in one of his own linen nightshirts, refusing to let anyone else see her in such a vulnerable state. She shivered violently as warmth returned, whimpering from the pain in her frozen hands and feet. I know, Charles murmured. It hurts because you're alive. He tucked thick quilts around her, sealing in every bit of precious warmth. Harley's eyes fluttered open. She stared blankly at the dark oak canopy above her, her breathing hitched. Philip, she rasped, attempting to throw off the covers. Panic instantly spiked her heart rate. Where is he? Harrington will... Charles caught her wrists, pressing her firmly but gently back into the pillows. Harrington is dead. You are at Westford. The boy is downstairs with Mrs. Croft. He is eating, he is warm, he is safe. Harley stared at him wildly. Her chest heaved under the linen shirt. Slowly, the grandeur of the room came into focus. The rich tapestries, the heavy silver candelabras, the familiar scent of sandalwood and bay rum that always clung to Charles. The fight drained out of her. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face into the pillow. You shouldn't have brought me here. Where else would I take you? Anywhere, she whispered, a tear slipping sideways across her nose. The parish. A convent. Charles, look at me. Look at what I am. Charles sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and brushed a tangled, damp strand of hair from her forehead. I'm looking at you. You are Harley. I am a ruin. Then I will live in the ruins, he said quietly. He didn't offer flowery promises. He didn't tell her everything would magically return to the way it was. They both knew the world didn't work like that. Society was a pack of wolves. When they found out the Duke of Westford was sheltering the widow of a criminal vice lord, the scandal would be absolute. But as Charles sat there, watching the exhaustion finally pull her under into a deep healing sleep, he realized something profound. He didn't give a damn about society anymore. It took 3 days for the fever to break. Dr. Lewis, a pragmatic gray-haired physician who had known Charles since childhood, minced no words. She is starved, Your Grace. Her body has consumed its own reserves to keep the child nourished. The cold was merely the final blow. If she survives the inflammation in her lungs, it will be a miracle of her own stubbornness, not my medicine. Charles hadn't left the room. He took his meals in the armchair by the fire. He read his correspondence by the light of a single candle so as not to wake her. When she coughed, a deep rattling sound that made his stomach turn, he held her up and pressed a cup of steeped willow bark to her cracked lips. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the pale winter sun finally broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting long, dusty beams across the mahogany floorboards. Harley opened her eyes. The heavy, suffocating weight in her chest was gone. The agonizing burn in her fingers and toes had faded into a dull, manageable ache. She turned her head. Charles was asleep in the chair. His cravat was discarded, his collar open, revealing the strong column of his throat. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked human. Harley tried to sit up. The rustle of the silk sheets was deafening in the quiet room. Charles's eyes snapped open. The instincts of a man who had spent 3 days waiting for death were immediate. He was out of the chair and at her side before she could fully push herself up on her elbows. Don't move, he said, his voice rough with sleep. He grabbed an extra pillow and slid it behind her back. I'm not made of glass, she murmured. Her voice was raspy, but it was stronger than it had been in the cabin. Charles poured a glass of water from the bedside pitcher and held it to her mouth. Dr. Lewis disagrees. Drink. She drank. The water was cool and sweet. When she finished, she leaned back against the pillows. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the cabin. You look terrible, Your Grace, she said softly, throwing his own words back at him. A corner of Charles' mouth twitched upward. It was a ghost of a smile, but it transformed his face, wiping away years of bitterness. You were in my bed, Harley. I think we can dispense with Your Grace. A flush crept up her pale cheeks. She looked down at her hands. The deep cuts on her knuckles were healing, sealed with a yellow ointment. Where is Philip? Asleep in the nursery. Sarah has been nursing him. He's eating like a starved hound. He's gained weight already. Charles paused. He has your eyes. Harley swallowed the lump in her throat. He has Harrington's temper. He screams when he doesn't get his way immediately. Good, Charles said flatly. He will need to be loud if he's to survive in this world. A heavy silence settled over the room. It wasn't the hostile silence of the cabin, but it was thick with the unsaid. The reality of their situation was a physical presence in the room, standing right beside the bed. "What happens now, Charles?" Harley asked. She kept her eyes on her hands. "I cannot stay here. Once the road's clear, people will talk. If it gets out that I am here, it is already out." Harley's head snapped up. Charles walked over to the small table by the window and picked up a silver letter opener, turning it over in his hands. "The servants talk. The doctor talks. There are already 3 letters on my desk from London acquaintances, delicately inquiring if the rumor that I am harboring the widow of a criminal is true." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Harley's chest. "You have to let me leave. Give me a carriage and a few pounds. I'll go to Scotland. I'll change my name. I won't let them drag you down with me." "No." "Charles, you don't understand." "I said no." Charles tossed the letter opener onto the table with a sharp clack. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. "You ran from me once to save my reputation and my life. You will not do it again." "They will ruin you," she cried, gripping the bedsheets. "They will cut you dead in the street. Your peers will refuse to sit with you in the House of Lords. You will be a pariah." "Let them." Charles crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped beside the bed, looming over her, a dark silhouette against the winter light. "Do you think I care about Parliament? Do you think I care about the invitations to Almack's or the whispers of bored countesses? I have spent the last 14 months in a polite, well-furnished hell. I attended their balls, I drank their wine, and I felt absolutely nothing." He leaned down, placing a hand on either side of her shoulders, trapping her gently against the pillows. "I am the Duke of Westford," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I own half of Yorkshire. I control 3 seats in Parliament. I have enough money to buy and sell the reputations of every man in London who dares to look at you sideways. If they want to cut me, let them try. They will find my hide is much thicker than theirs." Harley stared up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer force of his will was intoxicating, but the cynicism she had learned on the streets of London fought back. "And Philip?" she whispered. "He is the son of the man who blackmailed me, the man who threatened to kill you. Every time you look at him, you will see Harrington. You will see my shame." Charles looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he reached down and gently cupped her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "When I look at him," Charles said softly, "I see a boy who survived a blizzard wrapped in my coat. He is a survivor, Harley. Just like his mother. I will adopt him. He will bear the name Pendleton. He will never know the name Harrington. I will raise him as my own, and if anyone questions his blood, they can answer to my pistol." Harley broke. The cynical armor she had worn to survive the slums cracked and fell away, leaving her entirely exposed. She reached up, grabbing the lapels of Charles's shirt, and pulled him down. Charles didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her carefully against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, clean of soot and smelling faintly of the lavender soap Mrs. Croft had used. "You don't have to fight anymore, Bee," he murmured into her hair. "The war is over. You're home." She clung to him, weeping quietly into his shirt. For the first time in 14 months, Harley Linfield was entirely warm. The snow began to melt 3 weeks later. The roads turned from impassable white drifts into thick, sucking brown mud. And with the mud came the carriages. Harley watched Lord Richard Danforth's carriage arrive and quickly slipped behind the velvet curtain, unwilling to be seen. Behind her, baby Philip let out a contented burp as Sarah, the wet nurse, smiled at his healthy, rosy face. Once weak from hunger, he was now thriving. "He's a fighter, this one, ma'am," Sarah said warmly, unaware of the fear tightening Harley's chest. "Yes," Harley murmured. She let the curtain fall back into place. "He had to be." Downstairs, the heavy oak doors opened. Harley heard the low, clipped exchange of male voices in the foyer, followed by the heavy thud of boots heading toward Charles's study. The manor grew eerily quiet. Even the servants seemed to step lighter, sensing the intrusion of the outside world. In the study, Charles didn't offer Danforth a drink. He remained standing behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands planted flat on the leather surface. Danforth stood by the fire, peeling off his driving gloves. He was a lean, sharp-featured man who treated politics like a blood sport. "The roads are atrocious, Charles," Danforth said, tossing his gloves onto a side table. "I lost a wheel just past York, but I felt it was imperative I come down." "Cut the pleasantries, Richard. Why are you here?" Danforth sighed. He dropped the aristocratic drawl and looked at his friend with genuine concern. "Rumors are like rot, Charles. Once they set into the floorboards, you have to burn the house down to get rid of them. The clubs in St. James are talking. They say you dug Harrington's widow out of a snowbank and installed her in your master suite." "They are perfectly accurate." Danforth flinched. He had hoped for a denial, a laugh, anything but the cold, flat stare Charles was giving him. "Good God, man, do you have any idea what this means? The woman was married to a vice lord. Harrington practically ran the rookeries. He was a blackmailer and a pimp." "He was a dead man the second he touched her," Charles said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "It was merely a matter of who got to him first. The cobblestones beat me to it." "Be that as it may, she carries his stench," Danforth argued, stepping closer. "Take her as a mistress, set her up in a townhouse in Mayfair. No one will blink at that. It's expected. But they are saying you intend to claim the child. They are saying you intend to marry her." "I am." Danforth stared at him, aghast. "You cannot be serious. Charles, you are the Duke of Westford. You sit on the Privy Council. If you legitimize the bastard of a criminal—" "He is not a bastard," Charles interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "He will be my legal ward, and soon enough, my son. The peerage will not accept it. They will freeze you out. Your bills in Parliament will die on the floor. Your invitations will cease. They will cut you dead in the street, Charles, and they will tear her to shreds. You think society ladies are polite. They are vultures. They will make her life a living hell." Charles finally moved. He walked around the desk, his boots heavy on the Persian rug. He stopped inches from Danforth. He was taller, broader, and vibrating with a lethal, suppressed violence. "Let them try," Charles said softly. "I want them to try. The first man who cuts me in the street will find his bank loan suddenly called in. The first lord who blocks my legislation will find his shipping manifests audited by the Crown. The first woman who insults my wife will find her husband's gambling debts published in the Times." Danforth swallowed hard. He saw the look in Charles's eyes. It wasn't the look of a politician. It was the look of a warlord. "You're going to burn down your own kingdom for a ruined woman," Danforth whispered. "I'm going to burn down their kingdom," Charles corrected, "and I will build a new one on the ashes. Now, get out of my house, Richard, and when you get back to St. James, tell them exactly what I said." Danforth didn't argue. He picked up his gloves, gave a stiff, formal bow, and left. When the front doors finally slammed shut, Charles closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. A dull headache throbbed behind his temples. He heard the rustle of silk. He opened his eyes. Harley was standing in the doorway of the study. She was wearing a dark green dress Mrs. Croft had altered for her. It hung a little loose on her still recovering frame, but the color brought out the hazel in her eyes. She looked pale. She had heard everything. "They are right, you know," she said quietly. She walked into the room, stopping by the fire. "I know how these people work, Charles. I grew up with them. They will not forgive you for this." Charles leaned against the edge of his desk. "I don't require their forgiveness. You require their cooperation. You have worked your entire life to build your influence. You passed the labor reforms last year. You are trying to build the orphanages in the East End. If they cut you out, all of that dies." She looked at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "I will not let you destroy your life for me. It is my life to destroy." "No!" She slammed her hand against the mantelpiece. The sudden violence of it startled them both. She was breathing hard, the firelight catching the fierce, desperate gleam in her eyes. It isn't, because if you lose everything, they will blame me, and I will blame myself. I spent 14 months in hell, Charles. I survived the rookeries. I survived the cold. But I will not survive watching you become a pariah because of my mistakes." Charles stared at her. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound aching tenderness. He crossed the room and took her hand, the hand she had slammed against the stone. He ran his thumb over the faint pink scars on her knuckles. "Your mistake?" he asked softly. "Your mistake was loving me enough to sell your soul to a monster. My mistake was not tearing London apart brick by brick to find you." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. "I'm not doing this to be a martyr, Harley. I'm doing it because the power, the influence, the titles, they are utterly meaningless without you. I sat in this very study for a year, holding the world in my hands, and I felt nothing but ash. I don't care if they lock us out of Mayfair. I don't care if we never attend another ball. We have Westford. We have Philip." He dropped her hand and framed her face, forcing her to look into his eyes. "I'm not letting you go again. Do you understand me? Even if I have to fight every lord in England, I'm keeping you." Harley let out a ragged breath. The fight left her. She rested her forehead against his chest, her hands coming up to grip his waistcoat. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." 2 days later, Mr. Reginald Hayes, the Duke's solicitor, arrived from London. He was a small, round man with a permanent squint and a briefcase that seemed heavier than he was. He sat at the dining room table, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, surrounded by stacks of thick parchment. Charles sat across from him. Harley sat at Charles's right. "The adoption of a ward is straightforward enough, Your Grace," Hayes said, his quill scratching furiously across the paper. "But legally changing the boy's surname to Pendleton before the marriage is finalized, it is highly irregular. The ecclesiastical courts will ask questions." "Let them ask," Charles replied, pouring a glass of port. "I will answer them with a substantial donation to the Archbishop's Cathedral Fund. Just write the document, Hayes." Hayes swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "And the matter of the inheritance? As a ward, the boy cannot inherit the dukedom. That must pass to a legitimate blood heir." Harley flinched. It was a truth she had known, but hearing it spoken aloud by a man in a dusty black coat made it brutally real. Philip would always be an outsider in the eyes of the law. Charles's hand reached out under the table, finding Harley's knee and squeezing it firmly. "I am aware of the succession laws, Hayes," Charles said, his tone casual but carrying a warning edge. "The title will pass as the Crown dictates, but my private wealth, the unentailed estates, the shipping company, the London properties, the liquid capital, I can leave to whomever I damn well please." Hayes stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes wide. "Your Grace, you're talking about roughly £800,000. You intend to leave the bulk of the Westford fortune to the boy?" "I intend to leave it to my eldest son," Charles corrected coldly. "Write it down." Hayes wiped his brow with a linen handkerchief. "Yes, Your Grace." Harley watched the ink dry on the documents, realizing Charles wasn't just rescuing her and Philip. He was guaranteeing they would never face hunger or hardship again. That afternoon, they walked to the estate's small stone chapel. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass as Mrs. Croft held a sleeping Philip, dressed in an oversized antique baptismal gown once worn by Charles's grandfather. The local vicar, Reverend Miller, stood at the altar. He was a nervous man who relied heavily on the Duke's patronage to keep his parish roof intact. He held the Book of Common Prayer with trembling hands. Charles and Harley stood side by side. Charles wore a charcoal suit, stark and formal. Harley wore a high-necked gown of ivory wool. She had no jewels, no elaborate hairpiece, just the quiet, terrifying dignity of a woman who had walked through fire and survived. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He rushed through the liturgy, clearly eager to be done with the controversial task. When it came time for the naming, Mrs. Croft stepped forward, transferring the sleeping infant into Charles's large arms. Charles held the boy easily. Philip stirred, opening one dark eye to look at the man holding him, before yawning and closing it again. Reverend Miller dipped his fingers into the cold, holy water. "Name this child." Charles looked down at the boy. Then he looked at Harley. She was watching him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Philip Charles Pendleton," Charles said. His voice didn't echo. It filled the room, solid and immovable. The vicar hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to Harley, then back to the Duke. He touched the wet fingers to the baby's forehead. "Philip Charles Pendleton, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." It was done. In the eyes of God, if not the ton, the boy was a Pendleton. That night, the manor was quiet. The wind had died down, and the thaw continued outside, the sound of dripping water echoing from the eaves. Harley sat in a low chair in the nursery, nursing Philip. The room was lit only by the embers in the grate. The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside. He had shed his jacket and cravat. He walked over quietly and sat on the edge of the low window seat, watching them. The intimacy of the moment was jarring. 14 months ago, they had shared stolen kisses in manicured gardens. They had spoken of poetry and politics. Now, they shared the heavy, quiet reality of survival. Philip finished eating, his head lolling back against Harley's arm in a milk-drunk stupor. She buttoned her bodice and gently lifted him over her shoulder, patting his back. "He's getting heavy," Harley whispered into the dark. "He's a Pendleton now," Charles said softly. "We are notoriously thick-skulled and heavy-boned." Harley smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. She walked over to the crib and laid the baby down, pulling the soft woolen blanket over his chest. She stood there for a long time, watching his chest rise and fall. Charles walked up behind her. He didn't crowd her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You gave him your name," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was always his," Charles replied. He reached out and rested his hands on her shoulders. Harley leaned back into him, letting her head rest against his chest. His arms came around her waist, pulling her flush against him. They stood in the dark nursery, listening to the soft breathing of the child they had claimed from the ice. "We are not the same people we were, Charles," she whispered. "I have nightmares. I wake up screaming because I think I'm back in the alley. I am not the girl you proposed to." Charles pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. He breathed in the scent of her hair. "I know. And I am not the man who asked her. That man was a naive fool who thought the world was safe." He turned her around in his arms. He looked down into her hazel eyes, stripped of all the artifice and pride of their former lives. "We don't go back, Bee," Charles said, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "We build from here." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the fiery, desperate kiss of a romance novel. It was slow. It was grounded. It was a promise signed in blood and ink, swearing that the winter was finally over. They married on a Tuesday. There were no engraved invitations. There were no silk-lined carriages clogging the driveway. The ceremony took place in the same damp chapel where Philip had been baptized. Mr. Finch and Mrs. Croft stood as witnesses. Charles did not give her the diamond he had bought 14 months ago. That ring belonged to a ghost. Instead, he had sent a rider to York to fetch a plain, heavy band of solid gold. It was a worker's ring, thick and unadorned. When Charles slid it onto her finger, it covered the pale, jagged scar she had earned fighting off a thief in a Covent Garden alley. It was a perfect fit. "With this ring, I thee wed," Charles said. His voice was steady, anchoring her to the stone floor. "With my body, I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." Harley repeated her vows. Her voice cracked on the final word, but she did not cry. She looked at the heavy gold band on her hand. It felt like armor. The real test came 3 weeks later. The mud of late February had begun to harden into the crisp, walkable earth of March. Harley was in the morning room, cataloging the estate's neglected library, when the heavy knocker on the front doors echoed through the manor. She froze. The ledger in her hand slipped, hitting the oak desk with a thud. A few moments later, Mr. Finch appeared in the doorway. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed him. "Lord and Lady Wyndham are in the drawing room, Your Grace. They are asking for the Duke." Wyndham. He was a neighboring baron, a man of old money, outdated politics, and a vicious, moralizing wife. They were the vanguard of local society. "Where is Charles?" Harley asked, her throat tightening. "In the stables, Your Grace. I have sent a boy to fetch him." Harley looked down at her hands. She wore a simple day dress of dark blue merino wool. She was the Duchess of Westford now. She could hide upstairs. She could let Charles handle them. That was the safe play. But hiding was what she had done in London. Hiding was what Harrington had forced her to do. "Do not fetch him, Finch," Harley said. She closed the ledger and stood up. Her knees felt like water, but her spine was steel. "I will receive them." Finch blinked. A flicker of profound respect crossed the old butler's eyes. "Very good, Your Grace." Harley walked down the long corridor. With every step, she forced her breathing to slow. She pushed open the double doors to the drawing room. Lord Wyndham was standing by the fireplace, examining a silver clock. Lady Wyndham was perched on the edge of a velvet settee, looking as though the upholstery might infect her with the plague. They both turned as the doors opened. When they saw Harley, the air in the room evaporated. Lady Wyndham's mouth formed a tight, bloodless line. She did not stand. She did not curtsy. "Good morning," Harley said smoothly. She walked to the center of the room, clasping her hands loosely in front of her. The gold band caught the morning light. "The Duke is attending to the estate. May I be of assistance?" Lord Wyndham cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep mottled red. We were expecting Westford. It is a matter of the local magistrate board. My husband handles the magistrate board on Thursdays. Today is Wednesday," Harley replied. Her tone was polite but utterly devoid of warmth. "If you wish to leave a message, I will see that he gets it." Lady Wyndham finally spoke. Her voice dripped with aristocratic venom. "We do not leave messages with unverified residents. Tell the Duke we will return when he is keeping proper company." She stood up, snapping her parasol closed with a sharp crack. It was a direct, intentional cut, the kind of insult that destroyed reputations in drawing rooms across England. Harley didn't flinch. She looked at Lady Wyndham with the cold, dead eyes she had learned to use on the debt collectors in the rookeries. "You are in my house, Lady Wyndham. You will address me as Your Grace, or you will not address me at all." Lady Wyndham gasped, taking a step back as if Harley had slapped her. Lord Wyndham puffed out his chest. "Now see here, madam, you have no right to speak to my wife in that tone. We know exactly who you are. We know who your late husband was. Westford has lost his mind, but we do not have to subject ourselves to your presence." "Then leave." The voice came from the doorway. Charles stood there. He was still wearing his riding boots, mud splattered to the knees. He held a riding crop in his right hand. He did not look angry. He looked entirely, terrifyingly calm. He walked into the room, crossing directly to Harley. He didn't look at the Wyndhams. He placed a hand on the small of Harley's back, a solid, immovable wall of support. "Charles," Lord Wyndham stammered, "we were just—" "I heard what you were just doing, George," Charles interrupted. He finally turned his gaze to the Baron. "Finch." The butler stepped out from the shadows of the hall. "Yes, Your Grace." "Send a rider to my solicitors in London. Have them immediately recall the mortgage on Lord Wyndham's Southern Tenant Farms, all of it, due by the end of the quarter." Lord Wyndham's face drained of color. He went a sickly, ash gray. "Charles, you cannot be serious. That is £40,000. You will ruin me." "I am perfectly serious," Charles said quietly. He tapped the riding crop against his boot. "I warned Parliament. I warned the clubs. It seems the message did not reach Yorkshire. Let me make it plain. You have insulted my wife in my own home." "She is a criminal's widow," Lady Wyndham shrieked, losing all pretense of decorum. "She is a stain on the peerage." Charles's eyes snapped to the woman. "She is the Duchess of Westford, and you are a guest who has overstayed her welcome." He looked back at Lord Wyndham. "You have 90 days, George. I suggest you start liquidating your assets." "Charles, please," Wyndham begged, his pride shattering. "My wife spoke out of turn. We apologize. We meant no disrespect. The apology is owed to my wife, not me." Wyndham turned to Harley. The arrogant, posturing lord was gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate man. "Your Grace, please accept my deepest apologies. It was a misunderstanding." Harley looked at the man. A year ago, she would have felt pity. Now, she felt nothing. She knew exactly what these people would have done to her if she had knocked on their door in the snow. They would have let her freeze. "Finch," Harley said, her voice echoing Charles's cold authority. "Show Lord and Lady Wyndham out. They have a long drive ahead of them." Finch bowed deeply. "This way, my lord." The Wyndhams practically fled the room. The heavy front doors slammed shut a moment later. Charles dropped the riding crop on a side table. He turned to Harley, searching her face for any cracks, any signs of the trauma rushing back in. Harley looked up at him. She let out a long, slow breath. The tension melted from her shoulders. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. £40,000? She asked. That was a rather expensive insult. "I would have made it 80 if he hadn't left when he did," Charles replied, pulling her into his arms. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "You handled them perfectly." "I had an excellent teacher," she murmured against his chest, "though I think you just started a war." "Let it come," Charles said, his arms tightening around her. "Our walls are thick." Spring didn't arrive with a gentle thaw. It broke over Yorkshire with violent torrential rain that washed the last of the dead winter away, leaving behind blinding, vivid green. The war Charles had promised never truly materialized. The Wyndham's financial ruin served as a brutal public execution. Word spread through the drawing rooms of London like wildfire. "Do not speak of the Duchess, do not cross the Duke." The Tun was a creature of pragmatism, not morality. They realized quickly that moral outrage was expensive when directed at a man who owned half their debts. By May, the invitations to London began to arrive at Westford Manor, carefully worded, exquisitely polite, addressed to their graces, the Duke and Duchess of Westford. Charles threw them all in the fire. They didn't go to London. London didn't matter. Late one afternoon in June, Harley was walking across the south lawn. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of blooming hawthorn and wet earth. She wore no hat, letting the sun beat down on her face. The hollows in her cheeks were gone entirely. She looked healthy. She looked alive. Ahead of her, near the edge of the sprawling lake, Charles was sitting on the grass. His coat was discarded. His sleeves were rolled up. Sitting in the grass between his outstretched legs was Philip. The boy was nearly 10 months old now. He was a force of nature, stout, demanding, and fiercely curious. He was currently trying to eat a dandelion. "No," Charles said gently, pulling the yellow weed from the boy's chubby fist. "We do not eat the landscaping, Tom." Philip scowled, his dark eyebrows pulling together in a perfect imitation of Charles's own formidable glare. He let out a loud, frustrated babble and slapped his hands against Charles's knee. Charles laughed. It was a deep chest-rumbling sound that still caught Harley off guard. She had thought she would never hear that laugh again. She walked up quietly and dropped down onto the grass beside them. The skirt of her muslin dress billowed out around her. Philip immediately abandoned his campaign against the dandelion and lunged for Harley, burying his face in her lap with a squeal. "Traitor," Charles muttered, leaning back on his hands. Harley stroked the boy's dark hair, smiling down at him. "He knows who actually rules this estate." Charles looked at her. The afternoon sun caught the gold band on her finger. He remembered the broken, freezing ghost he had pulled from the snowbank. He remembered the blood on her knuckles and the terror in her eyes. It felt like a lifetime ago. "There's a trunk in the attic," Charles said quietly, watching the wind ripple the surface of the lake. Harley looked up. "What kind of trunk?" Cedar. Finch packed it yesterday." Charles shifted, pulling a blade of grass and twisting it between his fingers. "It has the heavy blankets from the cabin, the ruined dress, and the navy coat." Harley stopped stroking Philip's hair. The mention of the coat still carried a phantom chill. "I told Finch to lock it," Charles continued, meeting her eyes. "I told him to put it in the deepest corner of the eaves. I don't want to see it again. I don't want you to see it again." "Are you trying to erase it, Charles?" she asked softly. "No. I will never forget what you did to survive. I will never forget what it cost you." He reached across the grass, covering her hand with his warm, calloused palm. "But we are done surviving, Bee. We are living now. We don't need the code anymore." Harley looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked at Philip, who had managed to steal the blade of grass from Charles's fingers and was currently examining it with intense concentration. She squeezed Charles's hand tightly. "No, we don't." She leaned over and kissed him. There was no desperation in it, no fear of tomorrow. It was the kiss of a woman who had walked through hell, out the other side, and built a kingdom on her own terms. Behind them, the massive stone walls of Westford Manor stood solid against the sky. The frost was gone. The foundation held. True love isn't found in a crowded ballroom. It's forged in the absolute worst moments of our lives, when the polite masks burn away and all that's left is truth. Charles and Harley learned that survival is ugly, but the life you build afterward can be unbreakable. They didn't need society's permission to be a family. They built their own kingdom. If this deeply human story of sacrifice, redemption, and defiance hit you right in the chest, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves a romance with real grit. See you in the next story.